The night I was supposed to be celebrated, my mother looked across a candlelit table, raised her glass like she was making a toast, smiled at me the way someone smiles right before they say something they've been saving for years, and told me she wished I had never been born. The whole restaurant went silent. And I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't fall apart the way she probably expected me to. I set down my water glass, looked her directly in the eye, and said 7 words that changed everything between us forever. But here's what she didn't know that night, what nobody at that table knew. She had just made the single worst mistake of her life, because I wasn't just her overlooked middle daughter anymore. I was someone who had spent the last 3 years quietly building something she would eventually need, and when the moment came for her to come to me, she would have no choice but to knock on my door. Stay with me. This story starts in the worst moment of my life, and ends somewhere she never saw coming. My name is Reese. I'm 31 years old, and I want to tell you something honest before I get into all of this. I used to think that if I just achieved enough, my mother would finally look at me the way I needed her to. I spent 23 years believing that. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the middle child in a family of 3 kids. My older brother, Aaron, was the one my parents pointed to whenever someone asked how they were doing. He was their evidence that they had done something right. My younger sister, Sophie, came along 6 years after me and immediately became the soft spot, the one nobody wanted to discipline, the one who got lingered over at bedtime, the one whose school plays my mother never missed. And then there was me. I was the child who existed in the space between them. Not the achievement. Not the baby. Just the one who was always somehow in the way. My mother, Patricia, was not a woman who hit or screamed. She was more precise than that. She used language the way a surgeon uses instruments. Carefully, deliberately, in exactly the places that would do the most lasting damage. She would say things like, "You've always been the difficult one," or "I don't know why everything with you has to be so complicated," in the same tone other mothers used to comment on the weather. My birth, according to her, had complicated her body and derailed a version of her life she had planned before I arrived. She never let me forget it. Not loudly. Just constantly, in small doses, folded into ordinary conversation, so that by the time I was 12, I already believed that my existence was fundamentally inconvenient. My father, Robert, was gentler but not braver. He was the kind of man who believed that keeping the peace was the same as doing right. When my mother said something that landed wrong, he looked at his plate. When I tried to tell him I was struggling, he said, "Your mom doesn't mean it the way it sounds," and then left me alone with the sound of it anyway. His silence was its own kind of message. It told me, don't expect rescue from here. By the time I reached high school, I had gotten very good at making myself small. I didn't bring friends home. I didn't ask for rides. I didn't cry in front of anyone who shared my last name. I kept my grades high and my needs quiet and told myself that one day I would get far enough away that none of it would reach me anymore. University was that plan. Not a dream, an exit. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I spent nights in the library filling out forms, writing personal statements, crafting carefully honest paragraphs about first-generation student challenges without ever using the word mother in a way that felt true. I got in on a combination of academic merit and financial aid, with a part-time cafe job covering the rest. The morning I got my acceptance letter, I sat in my car in the driveway and stared at the email until it blurred. When I told my mother, she nodded and asked how much it would cost her. When I told my father, he said, "That's good," the way someone comments on decent weather. I told myself it didn't matter. I was going anyway. Those 4 years were the first time in my life I felt like I was allowed to take up space. I had a roommate named Jade who laughed too loudly and made everything feel safer. I had professors who remembered my name and meant it. I had late nights that smelled like coffee and ambition rather than tension and avoidance. I studied business and finance. I was drawn to numbers partly because they didn't have feelings, and feelings had always been used against me. By my junior year, I had started doing freelance financial consulting for small local businesses. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make me realize I was genuinely good at it and that there was a real market for what I could offer. I graduated with honors. I know that sounds matter of fact. But what it actually meant was 4 years of wiping cafe tables at 6 in the morning before class, of eating dinner alone in the library because going back to a dorm with other people felt too exposed, of spending winter breaks in a half-empty campus apartment rather than going home, of choosing every single day to keep going when the easier option was to stop. I made it. I walked across that stage. They called my name. And I still invited them to the dinner. The restaurant was a few blocks from campus. Paper napkins folded to look expensive. Fake gold light fixtures. Menu descriptions that tried a little too hard. My mother had chosen it because it was, in her favorite phrase, good enough. Never special. Never generous. Just enough that she couldn't be accused of doing nothing. I had ironed my dress twice. I had practiced smiling in the mirror until it looked natural. I had told myself, tonight will be different. Tonight she will see me. Aaron didn't come, he said he had work. Sophie arrived late, sliding into her seat mid-conversation, looking apologetic in the distracted way that meant she wasn't really sorry. My father sat across from me with his phone on the table, screen face up. We discussed traffic. We discussed parking. My mother complained that the chicken was dry before it arrived. I kept waiting. I kept thinking, maybe the toast. Maybe she's saving it for the toast. My mother lifted her glass. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it. This was the moment where 23 years of being the overlooked one would crack open, and something human would come through. Where she would finally say, I see you. I'm proud of you. You matter to me. She smiled at me across the table, that soft, prepared smile, and said, honestly, Reese, we really wish you had never been born. And then she let out a small laugh, like she expected the rest of us to join her. The table went completely still. I remember the sensation of cold glass in both hands. I remember the sound of a fork being set down somewhere behind me. I remember the couple at the next table going quiet in that particular way people go quiet when they realize they've accidentally witnessed something private and devastating. Sophie's face had gone pale. My father was staring at the tablecloth. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat with the words for exactly as long as it took me to understand what I needed to do with them. Then I set my water glass down slowly, looked my mother in the eye and said, then live your life as if I never existed. Pretend there was never a daughter named Reese. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I walked out of that restaurant without looking back. The night air outside was cold and quiet, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment feeling something I hadn't expected. Not devastation. Not collapse. Clarity. It was the clearest I had ever felt in my life. Like something that had been holding its breath for 23 years had finally exhaled. I called Jade that night. She picked up immediately. I told her what happened, not dramatically, just exactly as it had occurred. She was quiet for a long moment and then said, okay. Then we move forward from here. And we did. Over the next 2 years, I built something. I want to be careful about how I describe this part, because it wasn't revenge that drove me. Not at first. It was survival, and then it was ambition, and then it was the very specific satisfaction of becoming someone no one who had doubted you can afford to ignore. My freelance work had grown quietly during university. After graduation, I formalized it into a boutique financial consulting firm, small, precise, focused on family-owned businesses and mid-sized companies that needed clear restructuring advice without the overhead of a large corporate firm. I worked from a rented office above a dry cleaning shop for the first year. I had 2 clients, then 5, then 11. I hired a part-time assistant named Marcus who had the rare ability to be both efficient and human at the same time. I stayed late. I sent follow-up emails at 7 in the morning. I built a reputation, slowly and entirely on merit, for being someone who could walk into a difficult financial situation and make it make sense. I moved into a real office at the start of year 2. I had 17 clients. I was turning down work I didn't have the capacity to take on. I didn't call my parents. I didn't reach out to explain myself or apologize or give them a chance to reframe what had happened at that restaurant. My mother texted me once, about 3 weeks after graduation, I hope you're not being dramatic about dinner. You always overreact. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Anger had stopped being useful to me a long time ago. But because I finally understood something that had taken me 23 years to learn. Some people's version of love will always cost you more than it gives you. And the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop paying. Sophie called me occasionally. I took those calls. She never brought up the dinner directly, but I could hear the discomfort in her voice every time, the way she talked around it like a bruise she was trying not to press. I didn't push her. She had her own relationship with our parents to figure out. 2 years after graduation, I was approached by a client named Frank Dalton, a man in his late 60s who owned a mid-sized manufacturing company in our region that had been in his family for 40 years. The business was struggling. He had 2 sons who disagreed about everything and a financial structure that hadn't been updated in over a decade. He needed someone who could come in from the outside, assess the situation without inherited bias, and tell him the truth. I did that. It took 8 months and a level of diplomacy I hadn't known I was capable of. But at the end of it, Frank's company had a viable restructuring plan, his sons were communicating with a framework instead of instinct, and the business was positioned to grow for the first time in 7 years. Frank Dalton referred me to 3 other business owners. One of those referrals led to the largest contract my firm had ever taken on. By the time I was 29, my consulting firm had 12 employees, a client list I was genuinely proud of, and a reputation in regional business circles that had been built entirely on confidence, consistency, and showing up when things were hard. None of my family knew any of this. Not because I was hiding it, I had simply stopped including them in my life. Not with bitterness. Just with the quiet peace of someone who has finally stopped knocking on a door that was never going to open. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was at my desk reviewing a quarterly report when my assistant put through a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. It was my father. He sounded older than I expected. Quieter. There was something careful and unfamiliar in his voice, like a man reading from a script he wasn't sure he understood. He said, "Reese, we need your help." I didn't say anything for a moment. He explained slowly in pieces, like he was embarrassed by the shape of it. My mother had been dealing with a series of health challenges over the past year. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that she couldn't work the way she used to. Their savings had been impacted. They had made some financial decisions over the past few years that had not gone the way they expected. Some investments through a financial advisor my mother had trusted who turned out to be less qualified than advertised. They were behind on their mortgage. The situation had become urgent enough that they had consulted an attorney, who had told them that without intervention, they were at risk of losing the house within the next 6 months. We didn't know who else to call, my father said. And then, more quietly, Aaron can't help. Sophie doesn't have the means. We heard, someone told us you had done well for yourself. That you had a firm. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked out the window at the street below my office. I thought about a 12-year-old girl eating dinner in silence because the alternative was saying something that would start a fight. I thought about a college freshman filling out financial aid forms in an empty house over winter break. I thought about a table with candlelight and the sound of a fork being set down. And then I thought about what kind of person I had spent the last 6 years choosing to become. I said, "Tell me the full situation. All of it. I'll need to see every document." My father drove to my office 3 days later. Alone. My mother, he said, wasn't ready to come in person. He sat across from me at my desk in a way that I had never seen him sit before, small, uncertain, stripped of the quiet authority that had always made it easy for him to disappear when things got hard. He looked at my diplomas on the wall in my desk and the framed photo of my firm's team from last year's anniversary dinner and didn't say anything about any of it for a long moment. Then he said, "You've done well." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't what I had needed at 22. But I was 29 now, and I had done a lot of work in the years between to understand that some acknowledgments arrived too late to heal the original wound. They can still be real. They can still matter. Just differently than you once imagined. I looked at the documents he brought. The situation was serious but not unsalvageable. The financial advisor had made genuinely poor recommendations, and there were legal options my parents hadn't been made aware of. The mortgage situation had a viable restructuring path. It would take work and some uncomfortable conversations, but there was a way through. I could have turned them away. I want to be honest about that. There was a version of this moment where I said, "I'm sorry, I can't help you," and closed the folder, and it would have been, by any measure of what they had given me, fair. But fairness and wholeness are not the same thing. And I had spent enough years letting their limitations define what I was capable of. I wasn't going to let their failures become mine. I told my father I would take on their case, not as a family member, but as a professional. I would charge my standard rate, reduced by half as a one-time accommodation, and I would require them to follow every recommendation I made without negotiation. I would not be managing emotions or navigating family history during working sessions. We would meet here in this office, on a professional basis. He agreed. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, in the way he had never quite managed when I was a child, and said, "I should have done better by you." I nodded. I didn't perform a reaction for him. I just nodded and said, "I know. Let's get your paperwork in order." My mother came to the second meeting. She looked different to me in my office than she ever had anywhere else. Smaller, somehow, without the architecture of our family home and our family history around her. She wore a nice blouse and her hair was done, and her expression was the very specific blend of pride and discomfort that people wear when they need something from someone they have underestimated. She sat down across from me and said, "Before anything else, I want you to know I don't regret raising you." It was the most she had ever offered me. It was not an apology. It was also, I realized, the closest she was capable of coming to one. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I know. Let's talk about the restructuring plan." We met 4 more times over the following 3 months. I handled their case the way I handled every case. Thoroughly, honestly, without shortcuts. I filed the appropriate challenges against the negligent financial advisors firm. I negotiated a mortgage restructuring arrangement. I put a financial plan in place that would stabilize their situation over 18 months if they followed it carefully. By the 4th meeting, my mother had started addressing me differently. Not warmly, not in the way I had once ached for, but with a kind of careful, reluctant respect that told me she was finally seeing something she had been too defended to see before. At the end of our last official session, she said, "You're good at this." I said, "I know." And then, because I had not needed her to say it for a very long time, and because I had learned the difference between closure and ongoing suffering, "I hope the plan works for you. I'll be available by email if anything comes up." I did not rebuild a warm relationship with my parents after that. I want to tell you that plainly because stories like this sometimes get tied up in a reconciliation that makes everything feel resolved, and I think that would be dishonest. What I have with my parents now is something more like a careful distance with occasional contact. My mother calls on my birthday. I answer. We talk for 11 minutes about nothing too close to the truth. My father sometimes sends me articles he thinks I'd find interesting. I respond to those too. Sophie and I are closer. We had a long conversation about 2 years after the financial consulting was done, the kind that covered all the territory we'd been circling for years. We cried. We disagreed about some things. We agreed about more than we expected. We are genuinely in each other's lives now in a way that feels real rather than obligatory. My firm continues to grow. Marcus is now my operations director and has been with me for 4 years. I hired a junior consultant last spring named Diane, who reminds me a little of myself at 22, careful, precise, trying hard not to let anyone see how hard she's trying. I take time with her that I wish someone had taken with me. Last year, I bought an apartment in a neighborhood I love. I have a kitchen with a window that gets morning light. I have a bookshelf that takes up an entire wall. I have a Saturday morning routine that involves coffee and quiet and absolutely no obligation to make myself smaller for anyone's comfort. On the anniversary of my graduation every year, I take myself out to dinner. Somewhere with real lighting, not fake gold. Somewhere with a menu that doesn't try too hard. I order exactly what I want. I sit with my own company, and I think about the woman who walked out of a restaurant 6 years ago with nothing but clarity. She didn't know it then, but she had just started building the most important thing she would ever own. Herself. Here's what I want to leave you with. The people who dismiss you earliest are sometimes also the ones who need you most in the end. Not because you owe them rescue, but because life has a way of rearranging the furniture, and people who once stood above you sometimes find themselves in rooms where you hold the key. What you do in that moment, that's the real measure of who you've become. I helped my parents not because they deserved it, Not because they apologized sufficiently, not because the debt of the past was settled. I helped them because I had become someone who could separate what I owed myself from what I was capable of giving, and because I refused to let their worst moments determine my best ones. You can walk away from what hurt you and still choose, from a safe and grounded place, to be someone bigger than the pain. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. And now I want to ask you something. If someone who once made you feel invisible came to you years later needing your help, would you help them? Or would you walk away? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand. This is Velyra Payback. I'll see you in the next one.